Hello, everybody. Today I'll be taking you through my first TSM assignment. It's an intro lesson to energy flow in ecosystems. The point of the assignment is to choose a lesson you're least comfortable with in the syllabus. I'm Egyptian, and as you know, Egypt is a really big desert, and that didn't help me connect with the biodiversity and the animals and the plants in the ecology unit. I'm also a pharmacist, which means that throughout my 5 years in university, not one ecology lesson came my way. A big misconception that I always had is that ecology is not biology somehow because it looks at a big picture, not a small one like cells, bacteria, viruses. You'll find this lesson in Unit 1, The Study of Life. Under Section 4, General Principles of Ecology, the kids will go through the definition of ecology and ecosystems, biospheres, habitats, environmental factors that affect all that, and then they reach energy flow, and this is the specification that they have to learn. I've chosen 5th year group for this lesson because it's right there in the beginning of the curriculum, and it has exciting real-world applications that students are not really interested in once they come close to the exam, which is in the 6th year. Of course, students studied some of this in their junior cycle before they came into the class. They learned about the general meaning of ecosystems, a habitat, how different organisms interact together. They already had to explain how matter and energy flow through ecosystems, so they already know what a food web is, what a food chain is. They just need to dive into a more complex overview. Let's not forget the beginning of this chapter because they have already gone through what ecology and what ecosystems are, which means they have an overview of what we're going to dive into today. I made sure I addressed the misconceptions famous for this lesson, which is the fact that decomposers return energy to plants and that the higher an organism is on the food chain, it eats everything under it. So those are both not true. What will the students leave my class knowing? Energy cannot be created nor destroyed, and this is the physics cross-curricular link that I want my students leaving the class understanding, which means they need to know that energy needs to flow through the ecosystem all the time. And that energy comes from the sun. I want them to know that the energy keeps flowing by feeding. One organism eats the other, and that's how the energy keeps on going, and how the energy decreases as we go. I, of course, want them to know what a food chain is, how to construct it and how to understand it, how to extract information from it, especially a grazing food chain, which is a food chain that starts with a producer. Taking it a step further, I also want them to know what food webs are, how to construct them also, and how to simplify them in their heads so that they don't seem so complicated. This lesson is not just about the biological facts, it's about gaining an insight to the uniqueness of each species in the ecosystem and appreciating the diversity of life in all the organisms in the environment around us and touch on all the ecological issues happening right now. And that is the aim of all the biology syllabus. Yes, one of the aims is understanding biological facts and principles. But there's an even more important one, which is developing an interest and love for the nature and diversity around us. Add to that, they have to have an awareness of all the issues going on around them, whether environmental, technological, anything else. This lesson will help them realize that their decisions that they make every day affect the biological issues around them and how they can better those decisions. So here's how the lesson starts. The kids get an entry ticket at the door. So that sets a tone that once they come into the class, they have to sit down and start right away. This has the keywords and the lesson intentions because I don't want them to waste time writing it down. And then 3 questions: how do plants get energy? How do animals gain energy? What is the primary source of energy on Earth? Just to see what their previous information or prior knowledge is. After that comes my time, and I always tell my students if I explain for more than 10 minutes, stop me right away. So I'm just going to explain how energy cannot be created nor destroyed and how it flows through feeding, how plants are producers and anything that doesn't produce is a consumer, primary, secondary, and tertiary. After that comes the first assessment. So the kids will find a box on their desks, each group, and inside there are cutouts of organisms and arrows, and they're labeled eaten by, so that they remember it. And they have to construct their food chain. And I'll just give them 5 minutes. There's a timer on the board so that they don't forget. Once I make sure that their food chains are correct, we move on to the herbivore, carnivore, omnivore part. I just explain what it is and immediately give them a slideshow of animals. In a whiteboard, they use a whiteboard marker and they write down O, H, or C depending on what they think the animal is. We correct the misconceptions and move on. After that, they go back to their previous assessment for no more than 3 minutes. They add plus the primary, secondary, and tertiary consumer. They say, is it herbivore, carnivore, or omnivore? Once students have fully grasped the idea of food chains and herbivores and carnivores and producers and all that, we move on to food webs. On National Geographic, there's this website, and it gives you a food web and some questions under to answer about that food web, and it's a coral reef one, which is good for our next assignment. Students will use their devices, or I'll have it printed out depending on whether they have it or not, to answer these questions on the food web in the website. Students will read an article called Dying Ecosystems, which involves the Great Barrier Reef and how it's in danger. And this same article, one of them is at an easier reading level to differentiate between students that are not at a very high reading level. Students will fill a KWL chart before they start reading, which is what they already knew, what they want to know, and what they learned from their reading. After they fill the chart, they're going to discuss it, especially 2 points where why is it in great danger and what will happen if it disappears. Then I'll use the quick talk method, especially with classes that are reluctant to speak. So they get 30 seconds of one person talking and then 30 seconds of the other person talking, and they have to fill those 30 seconds. So they need to have their ideas already there in their head because they're anticipating the fact that they have to speak. This concept is not an easy one to teach, and that's why I know I'm going to go through some difficulties teaching it. Knowing your subject inside out gives you an edge in the classroom. You have a lot of examples to give from, you're more confident, you know exactly how to get your point through. I didn't feel that way about ecology, so I started reading and getting myself up to date on recent environmental issues. There were a lot of articles on the National Geographic website that I found to be very useful. I felt up to date even though I felt like the world is about to end a little bit. I also used my Netflix account. There were many documentaries that touched on the recent issues going on, like the A Life on Our Planet, Night on Earth, all amazing documentaries. I also realized that Ireland is a whole new culture with so much that I don't know about. I use YouTube videos to increase my knowledge about the Irish ecosystems. I had trouble finding something that would involve kinesthetic learners. This is because I usually resort to labs when it comes to hands-on activities, but this lesson doesn't have a lab. I tried to get creative with this one, so I added the part where they have to move the cutouts to create their food chain that involved a lot of freedom to move. And there was the second part where they have to write O, H, or C for carnivores and herbivores and so on. And that's also so they can move their arms up and get excited, get engaged, things that were good for the kinesthetic learners. I also know that describing energy flow in ecosystems is not easy on students either. Let's start with the confusing terms. Consumer, producer, autotroph, heterotroph, carnivore, omnivore all can be used to describe the same organism sometimes. This can be very confusing for the students. Food webs can also look very intimidating at first before you learn how to break them down. This is why I tried to simplify it. So I started with producers, consumers, decomposers. After they understood that and they were assessed on it, I added herbivores, omnivores, carnivores. And then another assessment, added that to it, and then added the part about food webs and how to simplify them so that at the end it was all tied together nicely. This lesson has a little bit of physics in it, and that is something that I'm generally worried about. Most biology students are not big fans of math, numbers, and physics. This is why I start by explaining something from the Butterfly Effect movie called Chaos Theory. And it says that something as small as a flutter of a butterfly can cause a typhoon halfway across the world. And I explain that that's because energy cannot be destroyed and that it keeps on just changing forms. And that usually gets the kids hooked on the idea. Students will be using 3 of their 5 main key skills in the senior cycle. Working with others, because there is group work in the lesson. Communicating, and that is due to the discussion that we're going to have. And finally, critical and creative thinking. When you work with others, you gain the skill of how to be a team player. You learn how to have a mutual goal and all work towards it. Being able to work with others is an undeniably important skill. Students are always going to need it, whether it's later on in university, or at work, or even at home with their families. Students are going to be provided with an article during the lesson, and they're going to have to analyze it and understand it. They're also going to be involved in a whole discussion about what they understood and how it made them feel. Students will be able to say their opinions and elicit other people's opinions about the subject. So that way, students will be looking at the same situation but from different points of views and look at it from the eyes of other students. Food webs and food chains and pyramids of numbers are all about relationships between different organisms in one ecosystem. Critical thinking is very important in this lesson. Students are going to be drawing a lot of flowcharts and diagrams in order to describe the relationships between organisms and the flow of energy inside the ecosystem. We're going to be looking at the ecosystem as a whole and as the little parts that make it whole. From the variety of organisms they're going to be provided with, they're going to have to compare them and contrast them. And last, they're going to be able to group objects according to what classifies them as a group. And they could reclassify them if they change the basis of that classification. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed my lesson on energy flow and ecosystems.